These are some of the craziest hostage situations in human history, starting with a crazy real story at the Olympics and getting more insane as we go. Our first situation started all the way back during this 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, where 8 members of the Palestinian military organization called Black September wanted to cause chaos and death where possible. The group climbed a 6-foot barbed wire fence carrying duffel bags full of rifles, grenades, and gas bombs, all without making any noise. Once inside, the group used stolen keys to enter an apartment of 2 of the Olympic athletes. One of the people in the room heard the scratching sound on the door, so he began to investigate. But once he was closer, the door swung open and he was face to face with the armed hostage takers. He quickly threw massive weight at the door in an attempt to close it, which gave his roommates time to escape through the window. The terrorists then shot the man in the jaw and forced him to reveal the location of the other Olympians. The man called Moshe Weinberg led the intruders past apartment 2, leading them to the apartment that didn't have any Israelis in it. Instead, he brought them to apartment 3, which was full of wrestlers and weightlifters. Moshe hoped that the strong athletes had a better chance of fighting the intruders, but unfortunately for him, they were all sleeping, which allowed the hostage takers to capture the athletes. The hostage takers then forced the athletes to go back to the coach's apartment, but on the way, Moshe attacked one of the gunmen, allowing one of the wrestlers to escape to the underground parking garage. Moshe knocked one of the intruders unconscious and slashed one of the others with a fruit knife that he found. But unfortunately, before he did any serious damage, they shot him in the head. Another wrestler also tried attacking the gunman, but was also shot and killed now. They then tied all the remaining athletes up in the coach's apartment and threw the bullet-filled corpses of their friends at their feet as a warning. Most of the athletes were also beat up to the point where they had broken bones, so they had no chance of fighting back. And after taking them hostage, the terrorists told the police their demands. They demanded the release of a lot of Palestinian and non-Arab prisoners who were held in Israel, as well as West German imprisoned founders of the Red Army faction, which was a far-left group in Germany. In total, the list had 328 names on it, and the second Israel heard the demands, they instantly denied it. The hostage takers then threw the body of Coach Moshe in the hallway to show that they're not messing around. The terrorists held the apartment full for 12 hours after that, which meant that the Olympic Games just kept going on like nothing was happening. Athletes were walking around, not knowing what was going on just a few feet away from them. At 5:51 a.m., the local police and emergency services were contacted. The government decided that instead of using the special forces who were trained in missions like these, to instead use the local police. And this would be a massive mistake from their end. While the plans were being made, a psychopath with a gun in the apartment kept telling his leader to kill the hostages, but the leader kept denying him, telling him to wait 5 more minutes. The German police only expected 3 gunmen to be in the apartment, instead of the 8 that were actually there, which would later turn out to be a massive mistake. The police sent a few officers, who ended up being disguised in awkward Olympic outfits with bulletproof vests, and they were launched in a rescue operation. The plan was for them to crawl through vents and kill the gunmen inside, hopefully without losing anyone. But instead, due to all the cameras and media that were around the village, the hostage takers spotted the mission on TV and threatened to kill 2 of the hostages. This made the police give up on the mission to prevent a bloodbath. The terrorists then demanded a safe passage with the hostages onto a plane to Cairo by 9 p.m. and for the police to instantly leave. The German officials were allowed to talk to the hostages, and by 8:30 an agreement was made. The hostage takers and their hostages were flown to a nearby airport, while the police was coming up with a second plan to rescue them. The police realized that there was a 200-meter long walk from the apartments to the helicopters, which they were planning to use to ambush the terrorists. But one of the main terrorists, called Isa, insisted on checking the route first. So he and a few of the hostages slowly made their way to the helicopter, while snipers were looking at them and a few police officers were laying right above their heads, ready to shoot them the second they spotted them. Isa slowly started walking over, and the police nervously waited for him to cross. But while Isa was slowly walking towards the helicopter, the police snipers had to crawl away in order to not be spotted, which turned out to be a massive mistake. Isa heard the crawling and instantly ran back inside with the hostages. This time, he demanded a bus brings them to the helicopter though. Their plan had just failed. But luckily, the terrorists didn't kill any hostages out of rage. After a close call, the group of hostages and terrorists were brought to the airfield, where the German police had set up officers in sniper positions around the airfield. I don't know why, but none of the officers had any sort of sniper training or any special weapons. They were just straight up just using normal weapons. The first plan was to have officers disguise themselves as flight crew, but at first they were denied from entering the airbase, which I mean, come on guys, this is starting to look bad for you. But when the lead officer was told about the idea, he rejected it, saying the terrorists would never fall for it. In total, the police tried to rescue the athletes a few more times, all ending in failure due to the stupid things like the armored personnel vehicles being stuck in traffic. But when the armored personnel carriers did arrive, the kidnappers were starting to become scared, fearing the plan might actually fail. At exactly 4 minutes past midnight on September 6th, one of the terrorists turned on a hostage in one of the 2 helicopters and fired at them with an AK from point blank range. 3 athletes were instantly killed from this and 1 was seriously wounded. The terrorist then pulled a pin on a hand grenade and threw it into the cockpit, causing the whole thing to blow up and completely destroy anyone still inside. He then sprinted across the tarmac and began firing at the police, who killed him with return fire. Another terrorist, Khalid Jawad, attempted to escape, but he was gunned down by one of the snipers. What happened to the rest of the hostages is still up to debate, as some reports say the police shot and killed the remaining hostages out of confusion, and some reports also say the terrorists did. The rest of the terrorists were also killed after a long fight, and around 1:30 AM the whole thing was finally over. And luckily only a few small lives were lost in this situation. But as the video goes on, you'll notice the stakes behind these hostage situations will only get crazier. Like for example in the next one, where over 100 children and adults were taken hostage because of the Dutch government. Imagine it's a normal morning. You take a train to work, but out of nowhere, the emergency brakes hit and you come crashing to a stop. You look around confused for a second before 9 men armed with guns board the train. You've just been taken hostage, and they're threatening to blow up this train as well as a middle school with 100 children if you don't listen to them. The hostage situation started when terrorists boarded a train and threatened the lives of the driver and mechanic to leave the vehicle. The armored terrorists then began selecting passengers at random, gathering a group of around 40 of them. Those lucky few were instructed to leave the train, but over 54 were still left inside. Those still on the train were forced to help the hijackers barricade the doors and cover up windows, obviously so the special forces couldn't see inside. While people were working on the barricades, warning shots were fired into the cabin by the terrorists to scare those inside. And at the same time, 4 armed terrorists took 105 children and 5 teachers hostage at a nearby middle school, threatening to blow up the whole school if the government didn't listen to their demands. The hijackers wanted the Dutch government to release 21 prisoners who were involved with previous attacks, a way to talk to the terrorists at school, and also for the Dutch government to raise awareness about the situation in their homeland. And if they failed to meet those demands, that both the school and the train would be blown up. The deadline for the demands slowly approached as everyone on the train was nervous, while the hijackers were waiting for the negotiators to arrive. The Dutch government was not planning on agreeing to the demands of the hijackers, since they assumed it was all a bluff. If they're wrong about this, it can mean that hundreds of innocent children and people would be killed because of one mistake. At this point, the hijacking had been going on for over a day, and people were starting to get tired. But when the deadline approached, then the government was given one final warning to step in and meet the demands. They didn't. Everyone waited nervously when the deadline was coming near, but the special forces were still very busy gathering information about the hostage situation. They knew that over 50 people were still on board, as well as 9 hijackers. The passengers were split up into 2 cabins, one for the men and one for the women. 4 of the hijackers were located at the front of the train, one in between the male and female cabins, and the rest behind the hostages. But this information wouldn't be of much use if they didn't follow through with their threats. And when the last minute passed, nothing happened. Instead, the hijackers gave a new set of demands. This time, they wanted the plane to be prepared with enough fuel to make it to the country of their choice. After the Dutch government didn't comply, everyone in the train would be shot dead. The government still had no intentions to listen to the hijackers, which was starting to piss them off. So to show how serious the hijackers were, one of the armed terrorists grabbed 3 pieces of rope, a bunch of blindfolds, and went into the passenger's cabin. Special forces were terrified of what he might do, so when they saw him making nooses, they were terrified. The passengers were blindfolded and the nooses were placed around their necks. Passengers were then dragged outside the train, and the special forces were warned that things could go really south if they didn't listen to them. The screaming fears of the passengers finally started talks of negotiation on the 31st of May, almost a week after the incident had started. The hijackers wanted negotiators to be sent to the train so they could talk face to face, and after many discussions, the crisis team sent 2 members of the Dutch Moluccani community to go meet with them. Finally, progress seemed to be made after over 10 days of terror, which is when one of the terrorists again went into the passenger cabin with no warning. No one knew if the negotiators had upset the terrorists or what they had been planning on doing. So when he dragged out 2 pregnant women, everyone was shocked. But to their shock, he let them go. They had just shown a sign of good faith, which relieved everyone in the country. Although the hijackers were unaware of the fact that the special forces had secretly planted listening devices in the food and water that was going into the train, so they could listen on every single conversation the hijackers were having. And this is how they knew when to comply with their requests and when to hold their ground. They knew exactly when their lives of the people on board were in danger and when they were bluffing. And after 10 days of terror, and after the negotiations had become completely useless, they were ready to make an ended the situation. With the previously collected information, the government had set up a plan to kill hostage takers on board the train. The idea was to have fighter jets fly over and shock all the hostages and make sure they didn't cause any extra chaos. Then snipers would take out terrorists, after which the special forces would board the train. The plan was put into action on the morning of June 11th, where snipers fired into the front of the train, heavily wounding 2 hostage takers, killing one and leaving one completely fine. 3 snipers then fired into the middle of the train where 2 hostage takers were supposed to be, but instead the terrorists swapped themselves with hostages that night before, so unfortunately 1 woman was killed instantly and 1 was wounded. At the back of the train, most of the hijackers were killed by the sniper fire, but this meant that there were living hijackers on the train that were now blending in with the crowd. After the snipers were done firing, Marines set board on the train, where they placed explosives on the door to break in, which failed to explode for the first team of Marines. They instead crawled in through the windows and found no one in the last part of the train, like expected. The second group of Marines blew open the doors to the second compartment of the train and unexpectedly encountered a hostage taker. They quickly killed her, turned around and started clearing the other side of the train. The last group of Marines went into the front of the train and encountered 4 hostage takers, 2 of which were already dead and other 2 surrendered without a fight, partially because they had already been shot by snipers. In total, 6 of the hostage takers were killed and 2 hostages after almost 3 weeks of work, and the terror had finally ended. But hey, if you found this information insightful, click the video on screen. YouTube thinks you'll like it. We do too. It's a pretty funny video. Right, bye bye.